So this morning I was bored and I decided to make a Rocket Lab price model. So here it is. The conclusion I came to is that in 2031, which is how long I predicted the stock price for, the stock price will be $23.26 a share, which is about a 7.5x from where we are today. So a lot to go. It's to the moon. It's to the moon. You can see here the breakdown by segment. So the real insight from this price model that I gained is Rocket Lab will not be a rocket company. It will be a space systems company. They will build parts for satellites. This is where the majority of their revenue will come from. In the same way that Amazon isn't an e-commerce business, it's a web services business. Rocket Lab will be somewhat similar to that, getting more of their revenue from space systems than from launching Neutron or Electron. So here we have the model where all of the actual predicting is done, and I'll start with the Electron segment. You see these first three columns are done with just historical data on launches, and I extrapolated out from their launch revenue here, the price per launch, the revenue per launch rather, starts around 5 million, which is surprisingly low. $5 million per launch. This company isn't making money at this point. They're still not profitable. So they're, by this price model, they're not going to be profitable around till 2026. So $5 million per launch is a very low number for 2020. So you see that gradually increasing as we get to 2022, which is the last historical data we have. I could actually predict the current price per launch with the quarterly data, but here's this works. You get the message, right? So I have the revenue per launch evening out at around $7 million per launch. I haven't heard any guidance on this. It just seems like a nice place for it to even out. And especially with how much more competition there will be in small sat launching, rideshare, Falcon 9 transporter missions, or all the other companies that are doing small sat launches. This seems like an alright number to go for, if not it coming down in the late 2020s because of all the competition that will be in this market. If another company does start successfully launching small satellites. There isn't a good track record with Relativity Astrospace. Rocket Lab really own the dedicated small sat launch market. So I have the expenses per launch at $6 million right here, which seems like a reasonable number. I kind of made it up. There is some guidance on this. You can extrapolate out. Right now, Rocket Lab isn't making money off Electron. It's losing money, all in all. Well, they're losing money all in all when you include space systems. So I'm assuming the Electron isn't making any money, which seems like a fair assumption reading their quarterly filings. So $6 million, this seems like a fair place for it to be profitable. I can't see how the launch cost will be more than $10 million or below $6 million in the future. Except, as you can see in the price model, getting down to $3 million with reusability. So $6 million seems like a good number to me. They've done around 6 launches in the beginning half of 2023. I assume they'll do 12 in the full year. I haven't looked at their launch manifest. Would have been a smart thing to do looking back. But 12 seems like an alright number. Maybe 11, maybe 12, but that doesn't affect earnings too much. As you can see, the profit per launch is $1 million. This space systems will be much, much higher in terms of profit than launching. Later into this decade, I have the price per launch dropping from 6 million to 5 million to 4 to 3. I came to this conclusion listening to the 2022 Investor Day talk, where Adam Spice, in the financial section of the talk, says they can get a 25% cost reduction in launching 12 to 24 times per year, just increasing the amount of times they're launching. You get economies of scale here. They get an 8% reduction in costs just from finishing out all the infrastructure. Right now, there's still work being done at Launch Complex 2 in New Zealand, and there's a lot of work being done at Launch Complex 3 in Virginia. And furthermore, they can get a 62% cost reduction from recovering the boosters, which they tested out once. They haven't reflown a booster yet, but maybe they will in 2023 or 2024. So you can see the real profit from the real reduction in cost from recovering boosters comes in 2025 and 2026 when it goes down to $4 million and $3 million. Putting together this 25%, 8%, and 62%, I just pick $3 million. Maybe it'll be $2 million, 2.5, somewhere around there, but I'll try not to be too bullish, right? It might not even be $3 million, or they might make more from each launch, more revenue from each launch. So I think $3 million is an alright number where costs will even out. So the margins when the cost per launch is just $3 million, I have leveling out at 57% right here. This feels like a fair assumption, and in some guidance, I don't remember exactly where I heard this, maybe I'll put it in the description. Adam Spice said that launches may even out at around the low 50s for margins, and 57% close enough. I just picked the $3 million expenses per launch, so feels good enough to me. From the 12 to 24 launches per year number to get that 25% reduction in cost, I assumed that launches will even out at around 30 launches per year, might be 25, somewhere around there, but as we see getting later into this price model, Electron isn't the greatest source of revenue. You can see even right here, Neutron will be making, I estimate it will be making $280 million per year. So plus or minus 5 Electron launches, this doesn't make a huge impact at the valuation model. But I have 21 launches in 2025, 26 in 2026, which around that 24 launches per year number, 2 per month. Is that 2 per month? That's 2 per month. Had to double check. Right. This feels like a fair place for it to even out, and even in the later half of this decade, around 2029 to the beginning of the 2030s, this 30 launch per year number may not be exactly right. I wouldn't be very surprised if things like Neutron cannibalize Electron's market. Really, Electron is dedicated small sat launching to a specific orbit, and you can see things like Falcon 9's rideshare missions are already launching. It seems like they're launching more satellites than Electron. I'd have to run the numbers. Maybe they're around even, maybe Falcon 9 is more. So you could see a situation where rockets like Neutron can place way more satellites into a somewhat specific orbit for cheaper than Electron could. Economies of scale with having a bigger rocket means you can pay less and you can get more customers on board, which means each customer gets a lower price on their own. You can even use the example of Planet Labs, which has been launching a ton of their Dove satellites. These are Earth observation satellites that need to be put in somewhat specific orbits, sun-synchronous orbits, to get pictures of the same spot at the same time on Earth every day. And you'd expect these satellites to be the ones that are impacted by the exact location they have in orbit the most, and yet they are fine with launching on bigger rockets in not quite exact orbits. They launched, how many? I think 100 rockets on an Indian PSLV rocket. I don't know exactly which ISRO rocket they launched on, but you can see that Planet Labs doesn't need these exact orbits that small satellites provide, and you'd expect Planet Labs to be the market for these dedicated launch missions for small satellites, and yet they don't use it. So it's fair to say, from this reasoning, that Electron launches will be cannibalized by Neutron in the 2030s or late 2020s. Maybe this 30 launch per year number is wrong. That's what I'm getting at. So now we can move on to Neutron, the rocket that will really make a difference in the future of Rocket Lab, aside from Space Systems. Space Systems is a huge thing, but Neutron is the rocket that will allow them to launch constellations, and this will be a huge influx of revenue later in the 2030s, or around there, when they can really scale up Neutron missions to, say, around how many missions the Falcon 9 launches. Neutron, in a way, I think of it as Falcon 9 version 2. They really took just the core concept of the Falcon 9. Back when they were first developing it, it was just a way for SpaceX to not go bankrupt, essentially, and to complete the COTS national contracts and then the CRS contract. So the Falcon 9 isn't perfectly optimized to be a reusable vehicle, since it was not completely an afterthought, but somewhat an afterthought in designing it. They first just wanted to launch it and achieve those COTS missions to get the funding to keep SpaceX alive. Neutron is a reusable vehicle from the ground up. You can see this just in the way the rockets look. Neutron, with the shape of the rocket body made out of carbon fiber, a lot of things like this, it's designed to be reused from the ground up. You can see things like the second stage and the just built-in payload fairings. You don't have to parachute them down and recover them like SpaceX does. This all makes it much cheaper to launch a Neutron than a Falcon 9, so they can get much better margins than the Falcon 9 in the future. So here you can see in 2031, I have the cost per a Neutron launch being $30 million. There's a clip when Elon Musk was on the Lex Fridman podcast where he said the marginal cost of a Falcon 9 mission is around $15 million, I believe. And if you pile on all the fixed costs and everything they have on top of that, $30 million for 14 launches a year seems like a fair number if you believe the fact that they will get reusability nailed and they will know how to reuse their boosters. The revenue per launch number of $50 million I got just from subtracting from the Falcon 9 cost revenue per mission number, which I believe is just on Wikipedia, of around $60 or $65 million per launch. Neutron can only launch around 13,000 tons in expendable mode, I think, and 8,000 tons when it's reusable, compared to the Falcon 9's around 15 to 20 tons. So they can get a lot less useful mass to orbit, but you can see even the mass to orbit for many Falcon 9 missions is not hitting that maximum 20,000 kilogram number. Most large satellites that they're launching are a lot smaller, and most of Falcon 9's payload capacity is not used. But when it comes to launching big constellations, and like Starlink, at least in the early days, was maxing out the Falcon 9's payload capacity and just trying to jam as many Starlink satellites into the payload fairing as possible. Now it seems like you can see the number of Starlink satellites per mission has been going down because they're becoming more and more massive, so they can't fill up the entire payload fairing anymore like they used to in the early launches with 60 satellites per launch. So all of this is to say that $50 million is around $10 to $15 million less than how much Falcon 9 makes per mission now, and it seems like a fair number. Maybe something like Starship will completely obliterate this market in the future, but we can see even with Falcon 9, SpaceX is keeping their costs at around $60 to $70 million. This is how much they charge per mission, even when the marginal cost of a Falcon 9 mission is $15 million. They could charge much, much less for these launches, but they don't, because it's a business. They like making money. Can't blame them. So based off that, I think it's fair to assume that launches will be around $50 million going into the future. Maybe in the 2030s, this will decrease. I'll model that out when we hit 2031 and the stock is higher. Maybe I'll model out the next 10 years and see where we are from there. Now, in modeling out the number of launches that Neutron does per year, there isn't an exact way to do this. Rocket Lab doesn't have exact mission dates, and it's a new experimental rocket, so obviously this might slip. It's not like they're going to be launching 100 times a year like Falcon 9 is. If there's a Falcon 9 mission scheduled, you can say with a good amount of certainty that it will launch when they say it will, because they have so much experience launching Falcon 9s. With Neutron, this isn't the case. Right? The first launch is right now scheduled for Q4 2024. This doesn't seem completely accurate to me. I'd bet a good amount of money that it'd slip into the future, so I have the first launch here in 2025. This obviously isn't going to make any money. It's a test launch, assuming it goes well, which it may not go well, which will just delay this revenue that Rocket Lab could get into the future. You can't exactly just shift this over one column down 1 year, but it would be somewhere around there. So the first launch doesn't make any money, obviously. I have 2 launches happening in 2026, ramping up slightly, somewhat gradually, to 14 launches in 2031. There isn't a great way to predict how fast this launch rate will scale up, but we can look at the Falcon 9 missions, the first Falcon 9 missions. You can see this launch outcomes chart. We can assume that Neutron will follow, the chart of Neutron launches will follow a similar shape to this Falcon 9 chart. Not exactly, obviously. We can assume maybe it'll happen faster. You won't have this dip in 2011 when they didn't launch. Who knows why? Maybe in Eric Berger's new book we'll find out. But the number of Neutron launches will be somewhat similar to this, maybe a little squished, maybe a little expanded to this chart right here of the early Falcon 9 missions. So 14 launches in the 7th year of Neutron launches seems accurate to me. With this 14 launch a year number, we can see that if we assume they'll make $50 million a year, this is $700 million a year in revenue, $420 million a year in costs, and this is almost a $300 million net profit, and this is more than 2 times the profit from Electron missions. And as we get into the future with more Neutron missions, maybe 50 a year, around maybe 100 a year around what SpaceX is doing with Falcon 9s right now, Neutron will really blow Electron out of the water. They could cancel the entire Electron program in the 2030s and it won't make much impact on it. And like I said earlier, when I talked about launching small satellites on rideshare missions versus dedicated small sat missions, maybe the demand won't even be there for Electron to do more than 10 or 20 flights per year. And now we can get to the very cloudy part of this valuation model, which is space systems. It's very hard to predict how much Rocket Lab will make from space systems, because for predicting neutron and electron profitability, it's not difficult. Just predict the number of launches. This is a relatively easy thing to do. But predicting how much they will make from putting components in other satellites, this is much harder to do. Like this total addressable market number, this is from the 2022 Investor Day they did, when they showed predictions from some experts that say it will be $46.3 billion in 2031. But they didn't show the exact numbers. I had to go in and count the pixels, see how high each bar on the graph is. But $46.3 billion sounds reasonable. Satellites are obviously an exponentially growing market. There'll be more and more things possible to do in space, so this number seems fine to me. In the future, it'd be nice to expand my price model to include the model of how much the total addressable market will be for putting components in satellites, which is a very difficult thing to do. But for now, I'll just trust the experts. So we have the historic data for 2021 and 2022 down here for their market share in here. This can just be gained from seeing their space systems revenue as a ratio of the total addressable market. So I keep the market share around 4 to 3% going through the decade and into 2030s. The gross margins start at 25%, and looking at Rocket Lab's quarterly presentation, it seems like it could be around there in 2023, and they've guided that it'll get to around 50%, and you can see the individual margins of the startups they've acquired to do space systems. So 50% seems like a fair number. I had it evening out at 40% here. Maybe this will be wrong, maybe it won't. I'll try not to be too bullish. From this market share and gross margins numbers, we can get the revenue, which in 2031 is $1.62 billion for Rocket Lab. You can compare that to Neutron, which is $700 million. So Rocket Lab really is a space systems company. And I think going into the future, if they can get more than 3.5% of this market, it can just explode, and Rocket Lab will make way more money from space systems than they will from launch. And I think this is one of Rocket Lab's real strengths as a company. You can see other launch companies just going bankrupt, losing insane amounts of money trying to launch rockets. You can see even Astra, which launched I think 7 times and failed 6 times, something absurd like that. They're getting into making Hall effect thrusters for OneWeb satellites now, I think, to add extra money into the company, because making rockets is very, very difficult. So if Rocket Lab can rely on the space systems business to keep them afloat, or at least give them a lot more money to work with while getting Neutron up and running, something that will cost a lot of money, they'll be much safer as a company, and I don't see a possibility of them going completely bankrupt if they have this space systems business. I could see the possibility of them losing a ton of money in 2025 and 2026 over here if Neutron fails to launch maybe 2 times in a row or something, and they just lose colossal amounts of money and can't unlock the revenue from Neutron launches. It's possible that with their cash on hand, they might, if they have multiple failed Neutron launches in a row and can't unlock this revenue early on, then they might need to raise more money somehow, dilute current shareholders, something like this. So it's very good that they have this space systems business in the background. Not quite in the background, very much in the foreground. But it's good that they have this business to keep them afloat, and so Rocket Lab won't go bankrupt. Rockets are hard. Now we can get to the fun part of this video where we show the financial aspect. Finance is always fun, but we can get to the price per share of every year that we can predict from this model. So we can see in the finance section here, you have launch revenue consistently being lower than space systems revenue, which makes some sense. There's currently launch revenue is lower than space systems revenue, so it's not a huge prediction to say that this will carry out into the future. In predicting the cost of goods sold, SG&A, and R&D, first for the cost of goods sold, this is, my spreadsheet is broken? No, this is historical data. Okay. Predicting the cost of goods sold, this is just how much it takes to launch the rockets and make the components they put in the satellites. This is easy, just this line in Google Sheets. Predicting SG&A, this is slightly more cloudy. I don't know exactly the right way to predict this. I just assume it going up by $5 million a year well into the future. Seems like a fair assumption. Maybe it'll be higher. I don't see this being much lower, but feels safe to me. And predicting R&D, this is slightly more difficult than predicting SG&A and the cost of goods sold. because this is what they're actually putting into developing the space systems in the Neutron rocket. And Electron is still currently under development, somewhat. They just did the first HASTE mission, so there's still money going into Electron to develop it to do more missions. And there's Photon as well. So I have R&D peaking and then flattening out in 2024 at $80 million. Adam Spice, the CFO, said that the first launch of Neutron will cost around $250 million, I believe. So putting this out over the few years that Neutron has been in development so far, $80 million a year seems like the high watermark for how much it'll cost. And I believe he said somewhere I heard him say that the cost will have the high watermark in 2024. So $80 million seems like a fair number to me. And I'm assuming it just stays stable throughout the rest of the 2020s and 2031. Feels like a fair assumption to me. Maybe it'll be higher some years, maybe it'll be lower. So based off all this information, we can get the net income and see that Rocket Lab, based on my assumptions, will first be profitable in 2026, making around $100 million and almost a 12% net margin. I see the net margins I'm predicting the net margins will go up to around 30% later into the decade. I didn't put too much thought directly into the net margins. This is just an output of the rest of the accounting you can see over here. 30% seems like a fair number to me, seeing the space systems at around 40% and Neutron being around 40% as well. Maybe Electron's bringing it down. Why is this 30% actually? With the cost of goods sold, SG&A and R&D, bring it down to around 30% from the 40% number you see above for the rockets and space systems. Feels like a fair number to me. Seems accurate. I'll go with it. Feels fair. So with all the finance done, we can actually predict the valuation of the company and the price per share, see how much money we'll be printing in 2030, see how rich we will be. It's so rich. It's amazing. So we can see Rocket Lab obviously isn't profitable, so I'm using a price to sales ratio, which is just multiplying the revenue of a company by this ratio to get a predicted market cap. I use the ratio of price to sales ratio of 10. Right now, with the current revenue, multiplying the current revenue by this seems to be an accurate way to get the current market cap, so 10 seems like a fair number. And continuing this out into the future until Rocket Lab does become profitable in 2026. And then making up a price to earnings ratio, because it's a somewhat fake number that Wall Street just invents. What is a price to earnings ratio anyway? Like, can someone actually explain that? It's just a number based on segment that someone kind of makes up. It's kind of real, kind of works, sometimes doesn't for some companies. I don't know. I assume it's 50 when Rocket Lab first goes profitable and then levels out around 25. The price to earnings ratio for this segment is around 30, I believe. Maybe I'll put it on screen. Maybe I should have done more research. But 25 seems like a fair number to me. It might actually be higher, around 30 or 40, since Rocket Lab is still a fast-growing business. I'll be a little pessimistic here. I'll be a little bearish. Maybe to offset all the other... Is this bullish? Seems bullish to me. I should actually make the rest of my cases. That'd be great. Make the bear, base, and bull case. That'd be good. Okay. Well, for now, 25 will be the price to earnings ratio, because why not? So from this, we can get a market cap of $20.7 billion in 2023 and a price of $43.26, a stock price of $43.26 in 2023. So overall, from all this, we can see Rocket Lab is obviously going to grow a lot. And I like to say my goal with this price model, fair valuation model, is not to get the exact price per share, get fair value for Rocket Lab today. I don't really care about that. I just care that if I had money to invest, wouldn't that be nice? That if I invested in Rocket Lab stock, it'll be worth more in 10 years than it is today. Whether that's a 5x, 7.5x, or 15x over 10 years, I don't know exactly. I just care that it's like over 5x over 10 years. This seems like the best path to invest for me. Long-term investing seems like the most scientific way to invest. Trading's obviously stupid. Gambling in the stocks casino. I don't see any other great way to get a return like 7.5x over 10 years, 8 years in this case. And obviously there are stocks that have returned 10x or more over 10 years. You have Tesla, Amazon, Apple, whatever. So being able to identify these opportunities and follow through on them, like with Rocket Lab, seems like the best way to get really, really rich in the future. I don't see any other path to make this much money. So this price model will almost certainly be wrong. It's just the question of how wrong. The stock price may not be $43 in 2031, might be off by $10, might be off by $50. Maybe Rocket Lab is bankrupt. But I can say with a mostly high level of certainty from everything I know about this company that it will more than 5x over the next 10 years, which makes it seem like a good opportunity, at least to me, to invest not your money in. Do your own research. Don't listen to a teenager. But it seems like a good opportunity when I do have money to invest to put my money in this. Well, thanks for listening to the end of this video. If you somehow did that, I will not be making another video like this. I only do this when I'm bored. I don't care about YouTube. Okay? I just wanted to make a video about this. It's cool. Okay? Thanks for watching. Goodbye.